Hello everybody, welcome to a quick video here on making a tiny cute horse diorama using your horse. Today I'm using Lena for this one. Now you're going to want to pick a day that is just utterly miserable. As you can see, I picked a nice rainy day to get on with this project. As we will be using 3D printed objects in our diorama, I first start off in Blender, which is a free 3D program that allows me to model and size the models I'm going to use. From there, I bring them into a slicing program, which is used for the 3D printer. This allows it to understand exactly what the model should be when it prints it. I use a printer called the Elegoo Mars. It's a nice, affordable little printer that prints in very good detail, actually. Once your print is done, you just take off little pieces of support and you get your 3D objects in the resin of your choice of color. Once those are printed, we take them into the paint shop. I'm just kidding. I take them just outside and give them a good coating of primer. You want to do this in a well-ventilated area as it's not that good for your health. A good first coat and a second coat will go a long ways to getting the rest of the paint to stick well to it. Once I put enough primer for a first coat on the model, I just place it down somewhere and I get on with the next model. The horse we want to be a little bit careful with, as we don't want to fill up all the little nooks and crannies and the details with primer paint. Always be careful when you're putting them down to dry. If they fall over, you're going to be repainting the parts that touch the surface. Once that second coat of primer is done, we can go ahead and bring everything into the art room and start deciding on where everything's going to go and what we're going to paint. This is the best part. In preparation of painting, I grab a paper towel, get my brush ready so I can get started on painting the models. We're going to start off with black. The black is going to be used for a couple of the objects. The first one is going to be the water tub. I just take a small amount of black and put it in my paint dish and get on with painting. It's actually a very simple process to paint these things. I just go ahead and grab my cheap brush, and the paint itself is actually just from the dollar store, so nothing exciting going on here, nothing expensive. You just go ahead and paint on the black, just making sure there's no translucent areas. I didn't do any primer because they're a little bit small and it's hard to get them primered. Paint is good enough. Now the black I'm using there is also used for the mats inside of the shelter. We're just doing a first coat, so being overly detailed isn't that important. We really just want to get a first coat on there, and we'll get to the details and fixing anything later in the second coat, as it is practically a guarantee to do a little bit of overpainting here and there. I tend not to worry too much at this stage. When I see little mistakes like there on the backboards, I'll fix it later. While I'm at it, I've got 3 more tubs to do, so I go ahead and do those because they'll be used on future dioramas. Painting these things is definitely not difficult, but it is a little bit tedious because they're so small. And like every good painter, it's always important to get a little bit of paint on your hands. Makes it look like you know what you're doing and you're a professional at the job. With all 4 tubs being painted for the first coat, I place them off to the side to dry to get ready for the second coat. Now, I've been wanting to say this for a long time. Here's where you get to clean your brush and just beat the devil out of it. If there are any Bob Ross fans out there, I think that you'll know what I was getting to there. I always make sure to give my brushes a really good cleaning in between doing different stuff. So I use the paper towel to sort of wipe and brush off any excess paint that's sort of stuck in the bristles of the brush. All right, it's time to start painting the wood in the shelter. I use a few different colors to get this done. Obviously, it's to personal preference, but I use a little bit of brown mixed in with some green to go with that. I don't think it matters which green you use. Again, my paints are all literally from the dollar store, and it is a matter of picking whether it gets lighter or darker and the hue of it based on what I paint with it. So I've got a brown and a green, and then it isn't too long before I decide that I'm going to make it a little bit darker. But I do like that it's not just brown. definitely a little bit of green in there helps it make it look like it's treated wood and not just something from a tree. Once I'm pretty happy with the colors that I have, I go ahead and start painting the wood in the shelter. This is a slow process, there's no rush, keeping in mind that the first coat, again, is just a matter of making sure to get a good coat of paint on, covering up all the white. When you think you've given it a good coat of paint, give it a once over, check it, try to see if there's any white, cover up those spots, then let it sit to dry. For this second shelter that I've been working on, I did the mats second rather than first to kind of show that it doesn't really matter what order you get the first coat done in, because if you make any mistakes, again, it's the second coat that fixes everything. And little tiny accidents are not a big deal. When the tubs have dried enough, I go ahead and give them a second coat to make sure that there aren't any translucent areas that you'd be able to see if there was a light shining on the diorama, because the resin that I use is translucent. When all 4 tubs are done, we put them down to dry, call them finished for now for their paint job. Now for the shelters, it's time to get on with doing a second coat for the mats. As you can see, there's a little bit white here and there, and of course when working on the brown area for the back, it bled onto the mats a little bit. This is where we start cleaning all that up, making sure that it is nice and tidy and looks like a professional job. Okay, as you can see here, I've got a little bit of paint on the back there. It's not a big deal because we're going to go ahead and fix that up by mixing together our second coat of paint. Now this coat of paint can be lighter or darker, doesn't really matter. Your first coat is really just to try to hide that white of the primer. From here, we're just going to make sure that we make it look really smooth and clean and get all the parts that we missed. And it is just slow and careful as we go. Lots of patience. As the second coat of paint is a little bit heavier than the first coat, we want to make sure to kind of smooth out the areas that look a little bit lumpy. With acrylic paints, you want to be a little bit careful about smoothing them out because you can actually just start to wipe them off the more that you wipe and wipe and wipe with your brush. So the point here is to make sure to be very careful not to wipe off any paint while at the same time cleaning up those lumpy, bumpy looking places that sort of show that you've been using a brush to paint the thing. All right, as you can see, the first coat and the second coat make for a very different look. Now it's time to move on to the roof. It is a metal roof, so we're going to paint it silver. My silver is a little bit old, so as you'll see here, it's a little bit lumpy. No big deal. Just take the lumps out and we just put on an extra coat because it's a little bit thin for it. That's what you get for dollar store stuff, I guess, but no big deal. Dollar store paint is plenty good for these types of projects. Just be careful how you're putting stuff on. Stay clean and tidy about it all. And when you're painting, be really careful not to have the brush fall over the edge. We want to paint and have the brush come up and off of the edge. Otherwise, you're going to get some bleed down on the parts that you've already painted. As you can see on this part of the roof, I've actually got a little bit of brown green that's come over. No problem, just paint over top of that. You'll never know later on. It's pretty inevitable that you're going to have a little bit of bleed over, as you can see using this magnifying glass with light. Now here's what it looks like the before and after. It helps to paint it silver. Well, it's time to start fixing little mistakes. So I got to go ahead and mix up just a little bit more paint to paint over those spots that either scrape off a little bit or get painted on by accident when we're putting on the roof. And the only thing about this that you have to be careful is to try to match the color as close as possible. So I tend to hold the model right next to what I'm working on in the paint tray, and then I can get it very, very close. Now it is kind of hard to get it perfectly close, so when you patch up the little spots that you do, just try to wipe over the area, sort of blend it all in. When working on the part that I made a mistake with the roof, again, I want to very carefully brush upwards and have the brush come off on the upstroke so that I don't get brown back onto the roof for fixing the roof silver that's on the wood. After that, it's just a matter of walking around the whole shelter and just fixing up the little tiny bits that are white or not quite covered. The next step is to add a little bit of accent color. Now this is just, up to you what you want to do with your own model. For me, these shelters are custom made. I'm the one who designed them and built them. And I do know that every once in a while I do not use the same kind of wood that I've used on the rest of the shelter. So I thought I'd make these ones just a little bit lighter to sort of give a bit of an accent to it. Making sure to paint both sides so that they show up from both the front and the back, as it's obviously the same piece of wood. Here you can see what it looks like before and after. Whether you like the look of it being the same color or a slightly accented color, it's up to you. Player's choice. I like it a little bit better. All right, we finally get to move on to painting the horse. Now what I really recommend is making sure to have some good reference images so you can get it just right. I've got lots of Lena, so I'm not worried at all. Getting the right color is important, so I make a few swatches and compare to the image on my phone to make sure I get it right. From here, moving on to getting those splotchy parts of her body painted in. I really did take my time here. I tried not to rush it at all, and I just wanted to get it just right. This has got to be the most interesting and fun and pleasing and satisfying part of this whole project, is getting her paint job correct on this 3D printed model. I think this model turned out quite nicely. From here, it's time to work on the little tiny details. Lena's got a big blaze on the front of her face, and her mouth is white. So after painting it that reddish brownish color, it's time to bring back some of that white for her nose and her mouth as well. This is a really slow and careful part of the project, as you don't want to get it wrong, otherwise you'll be fixing it later. If you need to be able to see a little bit better, you can always get one of those magnifying glasses with a light in it. But in my case, I really just need to be able to keep my hands steady, which I do by using the table a little bit to brace against. And I find it works quite well to get this very satisfying part of the project done. Once that part was done, I decided that I want to make her hooves look a little bit different than her legs. They're just straight white, but her real life body, their hooves aren't completely white. So with a little mixture of tan and white in there, I just put a little bit of an accent color on their hooves. I think it made it stand out just a little bit, just enough. Okay, one of the most difficult parts is actually doing the eye. If you have trouble seeing, you can use one of these magnifying glasses with a light in it. But for me, I actually have a harder time just holding my hand steady, so I got to brace myself. And in fact, sometimes the magnifying glass makes it a little bit harder for me because I can't really gauge the distance that well. I just braced my hands against the table so that I could get that little eye in. That said though, again, it's going to be inevitable. You'll make a mistake. Go ahead and just paint right over top of that and give it another try. Don't give up and don't worry, because it's very easy to fix the mistakes that you make. Once done, make sure that you're happy In my case, I was pretty happy. The eyes look just right, and they're just tiny little sort of dark brown dots. And it gives a little bit of life to the model. I think it really turned out well. The next step is to figure out the base. I tend to put mine on top of a large jar so that it's more eye level. Then it's a matter of figuring out where you want to put the rest of your objects in your scene. So for me, I've got the little tub. We've got the shelter that looks exactly like the shelters that are here. And of course, Lena. It wouldn't be a nice little horse diorama without having a horse in it. Overall, I think it's turning out quite nicely. Now the next step is to put some masking tape around the edge. This is because we're going to put sand in our diorama. And the sand, if we don't put an edge around, and in this case masking tape is a very easy way to do that, all the sand would just fall off. So what I do is I create this edge here so that I can have the sand stay in until I glue it all together. Now, it's not a very difficult process, but it just takes a little bit of time to get this right, making sure that that tape is sticking really well so you don't lose bits of sand down the side. Now it's time to add the gravel. I've got 2 different grades of sand ready to go for this diorama. Both of these are actually from the arena here, just sifted out into 3 different grades of sand / gravel. Being that this is a diorama, the sand looks like gravel, but it's actually very fine sand. So what I'm going to do is make sure that I can get it all to the edge, and I've got a nice even coating over top of my piece of wood. Speaking of the piece of wood, it's actually from the old maple that we had to cut down. That was rotten and dead and had caused a lot of trouble around here. With a paintbrush, I go ahead and I just tamp it all down nicely, because when you go to put your models in, you want to make sure that they sit on top of the sand and not just fall into it, possibly a little bit unbalanced, as some parts are a little bit packed and some aren't. From here, it's time to put in the really fine sand. And as you can see, pouring it out even actually has a little bit of dust sort of come up into the air. This is a very, very fine sand that only gets sifted through essentially a stocking. Once I have that all sifted through and tamped down a little bit, it'll be time to make the diorama. The first thing to place is the shelter. It is the biggest object in our tiny, cute diorama, and you want to make sure to kind of get it in there and just jiggle it a little bit so it sinks a bit. We're going to need to glue everything in, and without that sand sort of packing around, it's a little bit difficult to get that to really stick in. Again, I use a brush to just sort of push the sand up against the edge of the shelter so that it has something to stick to and actually ends up looking a little bit more natural. Once all the edges have been packed in with the sand there, it's time to move on to making those water buckets look like actual water buckets. Because right now they're empty and we definitely need water inside those water buckets. So what I'm using is a 2-part resin, and it is very simple to use, especially in such tiny little quantities. I will essentially just use what is a popsicle stick or a stir stick, and I'll dip it into one, I'll grab another one, and I'll go ahead and take that and dip it into the other because we don't need very much. And then take that into a cup and go ahead and give it a good mix. Now, when you're using these 2-part epoxy resins, you want to be careful not to get it on your hands because it's, not good for you. But I've been doing this for a little while now, so I'm not too worried. We'll give it a good mix, and don't worry about getting any bubbles in there right now. We're doing such a small amount, it just won't matter, and we'll take care of those bubbles a little bit later. All right, when putting them into these tiny, tiny, tiny little water tubs, all you do is just take a drop of it and drop it in. So it's no problem. Don't make a mess. Take it slow. Making sure to be careful. With that said, within minutes, they're all done and waiting to cure. Now, while they're curing, it's important to just give them a little bit of a flame to get those bubbles out. because there's going to be tiny little bubbles that will not make it look as good as it could. It's not the flame here that really gets those bubbles out. It's actually the burst of CO2 that does it. It just happens to be an easy way to send a burst of CO2 by using a lighter. When that's done, we take that little tiny tub with a little tiny amount of water in it, and we put it into the diorama and figure out where it should be in relation to the horse. Now I move it around a little bit to sort of pile up the sand around the edges, because again, when we go to glue this thing in, we want something to stick to it. It's at this point that you're going to want to make sure that your sand is looking the way you want it to look, and everything is just put in nicely. Checking that over, we're now going to start putting the glue in. I use a CA glue. There's lots of different types of glue you can use. I like this very thin CA glue because it sinks into the sand and absorbs quite well, and essentially just makes everything stick together and stay hard. And also make sure to get all those 3D printed objects set up nicely so that they don't move while you move this thing around. When that's done and dried and cured, probably a good 20 minutes is a great idea. I take the masking tape off, and I don't worry about any of that sand coming out. I'll just fix that later. It just shows us that maybe we could have used a little bit more CA glue to get those sand particles to stick. Like I said though, the finished product does not matter in this case because we're going to cover it all up anyways. With all the masking tape off, it's time to just go over a couple of little areas with some CA glue to make sure that that sand stays where it should. I hope you've enjoyed this video, checking out how to make a little tiny cute diorama, hopefully of your horse. We'll go ahead and finish up those edges. I essentially use just some cedar shavings that I had made, and then I fill in all those little empty spots with some extra sand and some CA glue. The end result, I think, looks quite nice, and for me really represents a tiny little Lena that I can put on my desk. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you guys next time.